make a durational performance piece, but there is some territory to cover. So you won't hurt my feelings if you need to duck out. I'm going to shoot for like an hour-ish, but we'll see what happens. I've done a few versions of this lecture. It's continued to evolve, and I would like to say that that means that as things have been added, other things have been cut, but that's not the case. So at the beginning, while we're looking at these curtains, we should all acknowledge that there is something maybe in this that's an exercise in excess, and we'll see where that takes us. Okay, so this is an installation that I presented last year at the Contemporary Art Center in Cincinnati for an exhibition that will kind of weave in and out of what I talk about tonight. The exhibition was called The Perfect Kiss, QQ, Questioning Queer, and this is the entrance to the galleries. These are hand-sewn ruched curtains that extend about 30 feet, and they're in this sort of shade of gray that hints a little toward lavender. The building that the Contemporary Art Center is housed in is an architectural design of Zaha Hadid's, and it's overall a kind of fantasia of shades of gray. So I was thinking about starting points and sort of initiation rites and passages and thresholds, and how to sort of deal with color that speaks to the architecture at large, and kind of intones it with something, this delicacy, this translucency, and this little hint of violet. I don't interact well with art, interactive art, participatory art. When I teach and students have participatory works, I usually refuse to participate. I think it's important for artists to learn how to qualify the no or the refusal when they have work that needs some sort of fulfillment through other agents. This work kind of evolved to become an interactive piece, though, as I was working on it. Initially, we had talked about the curtains being kind of spread open, and I came to decide that I wanted the curtains to be something that the viewer had to elect to touch and pass through and spread the veils to enter into the gallery. It's not the only entrance into the space. There is I guess what we might call a back door, and I'm interested in that having been open and full of all the possible innuendos of coming in through the back door. But to go through the front, you had to make a choice to touch these curtains. And after you pass through them, there's a cluster of labels about a number of works that you're made aware of, and one of them is the label for this piece, which, as you see here, is called Festoon Drape for James, Robert, Zaha, Stephen, and Eric. And it's the first move that happens in this exhibition, and also one that kind of repeats in different ways about power dynamics and forming relationships in my work, that I wanted the audience to decide to touch this art and then learn that it's actually for someone else, that they were touching something that's been dedicated to someone other than them, and the emotions that can come along with that. They were not the only festoon drapes in the building, so alongside that label was this a label alerting you to making you aware that there is a set of curtains that had been installed in the members' lounge in the museum, and that they were available for limited viewing only if you were a member. So this is hopefully already kind of revealing something about the mechanics of my politics in relating to institutional space, that there's something seductive and flirtatious and decorative and ornamental, but also aims to call attention to what we might take for granted that's unseen or hidden or exclusive, and that there are other spaces and sites within the museum's sort of organizational structure that's not fully accessible to viewers, that it's qualified and requires membership. So for the most part, these curtains were not seen by anyone. And so then we have kind of two layers here. First, the audience is touching the curtains that they have access to, and then learning that they're not intended for them, and then another set of curtains that maybe embody a form of rejection or exclusivity. I'm going to weave a few other artists' work in while I'm talking about my projects to give context, to talk a little bit about history. As you'll see, sort of drawing other artists' practices and questions about art history come up a bit in my work. This is a piece from 1974 by Michael Asher. For this work, Asher removed the wall separating the exhibition and office spaces at Claire Copley Gallery, revealing the otherwise hidden gallerist working at her desk. So this is a formal move, a sculptural move that's also one that gets credited at being in one of the early inception points of what we call now institutional critique. While looking at the slide, I end up thinking about a memory of growing up and occasions when I would ask too many questions to my parents. One of the punitive measures that was taken would be that I would be locked out of the house. And that memory corresponds most often to the question why, when my questions started to interrogate the motives of a given situation. So here we're seeing a gallery wall removed, but alongside of it, I guess I want to haunt this moment in the presentation with this mental picture of a door being closed to and of being set outside of a space, a kind of forcible othering, and being punished for asking questions. Something that I appreciate about Asher and then some of these other artists that I'll kind of glaze over here at the front end is a commitment to institutional critique that is an analysis of how the apparatus of art institutions create the context in which we can have meaningful experiences with artworks. But what are the political consequences? Where is the money coming from? What are the forces and decision-making going on behind the scenes? And that kind of interrogating process, asking questions of the institution, is maybe the sort of tenets of institutional critique, but I'm specifically attracted to a lineage that I hope to situate myself in of artists that, while doing this, also refuse to abandon something about a sensuous experience for the viewer, something either tactile or seductive or aesthetic that could potentially, at least for my purposes, be a signal for an underlying erotics in how we might look at the way institutions and their audiences and artists and curators and the other sort of constitutive players within the paradigm of the art world form attachments to one another, relate to one another in ways that are filled with our own fantasies and desires that get kind of played out between us. This is a work that I've become aware of after working on these curtains last year by Barbara Bloom called The Gaze in 2000. So the piece consists of a few elements. One is this the bar that runs along the floor that typically within museums is used to keep the audience at some distance from the art objects on the wall, that you're meant to stand on this side of that bar. And Bloom installs this in the gallery with the insistence that the only space that the viewer can occupy is this narrow, intimate space between the metal bar and the wall. And then the works that are put up, and in different iterations of this project, these are sometimes photographs or images she's generated, and other times things that come from maybe the collections or peripheral ephemera from the institutions that show this work, are put behind curtains, these sheer curtains that are flat against the wall. And so the audience has to make a decision that I relate to the one at the entrance of the Perfect Kiss exhibition, to make the choice to pull the curtain aside and maybe pay attention to the more nuanced decisions of how they're interacting with art objects, what they allow to affect them, and maybe complicating looking with touching and physically navigating the space. A number of years, I'm not going to read all of this, but a number of years after Michael Asher removes the wall from Claire Copley Gallery, Christopher Williams does several projects, but among them these photographic portraits of the mobile wall systems that are designed and utilized within exhibition spaces that have rotating exhibitions and therefore work with reusable walls. And so then this is a kind of calling forward, a calling attention to something that usually sits behind the work and becomes the object of portraiture. Maybe images that are full of a type of potential of what kind of exhibition will happen once this object is moved, and also something that makes you aware of the structures that compartmentalize and regulate the spaces in which we're engaging with artworks. Or to put that another way, maybe this is closer to that ghost image of the door being shut. On questions. Actually, I had the great pleasure while here of seeing some rare books in the library that involve Willem de Rooij's practice that I have not found readily available other places. So it's been exciting to scan some chapters while I'm at Cranbrook about discussions of his work. And so these are pieces that were in an exhibition just last year at Friedrich Petzel of a few different ongoing projects of de Rooij's that the wall works dealing with this kind of fleshy, sensuous, floral palette are woven tapestries that then get stretched as canvases. And then for a number of years, he's been making these elaborate flower arrangements that in many cases, each specimen is unique. And so there are sometimes over 100 different types of flowers in the arrangements. And so they are, they gesture to decoration and specifically the kind of decor that would be used at sort of ceremonial events in galleries and museums. And they kind of, they underscore a specific moment, this coming together of a really diverse population of floral species that then gets recreated at the collector's choosing. And this is maybe a project of de Rooij's that gets closer to some of the things that you'll see in the concerns of my work as well. This is a project from 2010 and 2011 called Intolerance that he worked on for years, I believe over a decade, to gather this, to work on this freestanding wall display that gathers together a lot of 17th century Dutch bird paintings and a group of 18th and 19th century feathered objects from Hawaii. There is no real historical correspondence between these two forms that he's gathered. And my interest in this work is, something about the artist playing within the space reserved for the curator and not acknowledging some of the responsibilities to telling an actual history, but instead creating something that's more fantastical and more about desire, of seeing how the desire to see these things next to one another. Maybe I've said artist and curator as roles, and maybe connoisseur is another that sort of hovers around this. And then I'll pause for a second. And then I think because there's a sort of facticity to the way this project presents itself, I feel compelled to immediately start thinking about and investigating the process by which these things came together. So it's an installation, a kind of curatorial gesture that actually signals the request for us to pay attention to how these objects circulate, how do things get curated, who are the gatekeepers, who are the decision makers, who are the risk takers that will allow work to be positioned outside of conventional history to allow an installation like this to happen. And maybe even more explicitly, I'm thinking about this video work by Andrea Fraser called Little Frank and His Carp. And it's actually the one thing that I would say is kind of cropped out of earlier versions of this talk that this is available on YouTube. So I'll encourage you, if you would like to know more about it, you can view it. I like screening it usually, but for the sake of time, I will just briefly describe. At Frank Gehry's Guggenheim Bilbao, Andrea Fraser, who's credited with being sort of second generation, but really influential in institutional critique as a methodology in contemporary art, visits the Guggenheim Bilbao and listens to the audio guide that accompanies viewers looking at the architecture of the building. Upon hearing it, she decides to make this work where she returns to the museum with a group of friends who have hidden cameras and are recording the audio guide too. And what she's calling attention to is that the audio guide is didactic and instructional in ways that really do, to kind of harken back to something I mentioned, elaborate on a kind of presumed erotics between viewer and gallery, museum, and artwork. And so the language is things that we're actually not that unfamiliar with. It said things like, notice the sensual curves of the walls of Frank Gehry's building. You could almost imagine yourself caressing this space in an intimate way. And so Fraser sort of creates a simple gesture of, what if I just do what this audio guide tells me to do? What if I physicalize? What if I embody the sort of the instructions of this text? And so what results is that she writhes against the wall, gradually lifting her skirt, dry humps the wall, passerby observe her, some are titillated, and her body becomes a sort of mechanism to reflect the ways that we're told to interact with this museum and the architectural design of it. And so from there, I will pivot back into some of my recent projects over the past several years. This is a photograph that was made at the Block Museum of Art in Evanston, just north of Chicago. And for it, I worked with a drag queen named Pearl, who at the time was a baby drag queen of maybe barely a year. But at this point, you might be, those of you who watch RuPaul's Drag Race might be familiar with her as one of the great contenders of season 7. Her face has changed a lot between this photograph and now, but we had been introduced to each other through a few different mutual friends and started having conversations about aesthetics, and especially this kind of white on white on white that was coming up in my work, which was, for me, very institutionally minded and sort of annotative of moves from minimalism forward that we see in Ryman and Martin, of kind of finessing nuance between these shades of white. And Pearl had her own set of associations for these kind of monochromatic aesthetics. So we started talking about a collaboration, and this was a photograph that plays into a number of interrelated works that I'll briefly outline. But to make the photograph, I wanted access to the museum early to be able to make this photograph there. And it's one of the ways that maybe we wouldn't call that outright institutional critique, but an analytic of how institutions work. They, when Pearl arrived, they had a moment of crisis, the museum staff, about which bathroom should Pearl go into and what should be her dressing room. And so they actually just closed all the bathrooms, and they put a sign that said, no one can use the bathroom because there are drag queens here and we don't know what they're going to do. And I'm curious about what just setting a project in motion can start revealing about the situation. I worked with a really good exhibition crew here that had to build these walls far in advance of what their normal schedule would have been to set up the exhibition. And then the photograph also sort of aggregates a couple of signs that we'll see repeated elsewhere, or I'll talk about. In one case, because there's no visual apart from this, is this flower arrangement. Another project that's happening in the museum for this exhibition is the first iteration of something I've done a number of times now called Sillage, in which I pick a ready-made perfume that exists in the world already, and I buy the bottle of perfume, and then the museum staff wears it for the full run of the exhibition. It's not something I force them to wear, but I spend a lot of time having meetings with the staff to answer their questions, to set them at ease if they have concerns. And at the Block, we had a pretty total participation from the director and curators and registrar and all the way across the organization to the janitors and the gallery attendants and the front desk staff, that there was a scent that marked their bodies. And so I worked with a florist who I've collaborated with a number of times since then, Heidi Joint, and she made a flower arrangement that consists of the specimens that are used in the fragrance. It's really one of the only places in the exhibition that you're even made aware that this fragrance is art and that it's part of this work, is this kind of representation of it in an image. How did I get to wanting to have a drag queen in the museum? It's not just because I'm a faggot. It's also because there are sort of institutional histories that and art histories that I was exploring. The block has a number of different sort of focuses in their collection. One of them is 20th century photography, and they have a lot of Man Ray photographs, but none of the photographs that related to Man Ray's project, ongoing sort of collaboration with Marcel Duchamp of his female alter ego, Iroselevi. So I started exploring, just like as I was looking at the museum and looking at what they had, and maybe more specifically what they didn't have, I was looking around to find out where were these photographs. And you might be familiar with the more sort of canonical images of Iroselevi posing. One of the images is applied to a ready-made perfume bottle, which is another place that Duchamp and Man Ray sort of whisper behind this project, how I got to the perfume project as well. But then I came across this little Polaroid in an exhibition catalog from a number of years previous. That was a Polaroid that Man Ray took of Duchamp trying on wigs and smiling back at the camera. And I had an emotional reaction to it. I was struck by this liminal state in between Duchamp and Iroselevi, this friendliness and this playing dress up, the playfulness of being able to explore these gender significations together. So I started working with contacting and negotiating a loan from the collector who owned the piece, James Geyer. And Geyer was adventurous, open-minded. One of the things that was important for me that he agreed to was that we listed the Man Ray photograph as a material of one of my artworks. So this is a taxonomical shift. This is a way of taking something from art history and not curating it alongside this photograph. It's hanging alongside it, but it's a titled artwork that then I'm claiming a type of authorship. That the work Matt James consists of this bit of narrative about coming into contact with this collector, and then his permission to list the artwork from his collection as a material in one of my works. Another appendage in this tautology is taking some of the costuming that Pearl wore for the photograph and installing it for the duration of the exhibition in the coat check at the museum. This part gets a little heavy, I'll admit, at some distance. My friend Doug Ishar came and saw the show while it was up, and I was walking him through it. And by the time we got to this piece, standing inside the closet, Doug said, "Drag queens, closets, we get it, you're gay. What else is here?" And there is some of that kind of heaviness in the signs that are kind of circulated with this, but I continue to be moved by the melancholy of these empty clothes hanging in the coat check. Even that had a kind of institutional ripple effect that they changed where the gallery attendant stood so that he could see inside the coat check to make sure no one was harming this fur coat and this dressing gown. And even across the exhibition, hearing from the museum staff that there were people who did almost like played right into their part, that people came and said, like, is someone wandering around in their nightgown? Like, who left these things in the closet? There was also not a label for this directly beside the work. Pivot point. I guess I will say about this work that it, as I'm kind of listing off, it put pressures on the museum to accommodate me and to accommodate my whims and my questions and my friends showing up in drag, and I think this is something that I guess I'll kind of try to weave through when I'm saying through the talk that that this sort of early scene that I've remembered at the beginning, I think does get reenacted across my work. I think I'm telling you that once upon a time, several times upon a time, I was locked out of the house for asking too many questions, because I think I continue to reenact that scene. I think a lot of times my work has a petulance to say, is this going to get me kicked out? Are you going to lock me out now? Are you going to reject me now? What's going to happen now? And why will it happen? And there's also a bit of maybe sort of personal backdrop that I'll share too, that came up last night in our dinner and book discussion with some of the graduate students here. That I was born a twin, and that will come up a little bit throughout this talk, as personal autobiography has gradually come to be laid out alongside my more art historical inquiries. And we were born as conjoined twins and were separated 4 days after birth. So this repeated motif of a missing body, of clothes marking out where a figure might be, I think does a couple of things related to that point of origin, that there is a melancholy, there's a sort of ongoing sense of loss. And also I think it hopefully betrays that that when I find myself in other new situations that get invented within my practice, but also in my personal life, that separation, that slicing off our bodies from one another tends to get transferred and projected onto new situations. And I disclose that not to be personal and maudlin, but to maybe posit a methodology by which we can analyze how our personal stakes get projected and arranged across the context we find ourselves in professionally within our field. So this is an installation view of The Perfect Kiss, QQ, Questioning Queer. I took as my point of inquiry for this project the life and work of the American conceptualist James Lee Byers, who passed away in Egypt in 1997, but was born in Detroit, which is nearby here. And so my interest in Byers, not unlike my interest in Man Ray and Duchamp and other interests in artists like Florian Stettheimer, is that they sit on spaces where none of them ever came out, none of them ever identified. Maybe that's like what the language that I'll kind of play with tonight in tonight's version of this lecture, is that these artists made work sort of in spite of easy identification, which is not to say that there was ever really adamant refusal to being aligned with queerness or being gay or having non-normative sexual preferences, but that there is a suspended openness in the work that maybe doesn't get preserved through the history. And so as I was looking at Byers, maybe one example is that, like, if you Google image search Byers, you're going to get a lot of the grandiosity, a lot of gold, a lot of red, a lot of black, a lot of monolithic sort of singular forms, a lot of sort of orientalizing, colonizing, Zen aesthetics that he plays with. But there are all of these other corners of his work that are blushing and delicate and risk being infatuated in all the wrong places, and are sort of inelegant, that are exquisitely elegant but awkward simultaneously. And so I think what first drew me to working on this exhibition was to maybe try to coax out these less visible details from his oeuvre, and see what happens if I just, for the most part, with maybe one major exception, eliminate the dominant narrative, the things most commonly regaled about him as a sort of heroic figure, and instead maybe look for the more romantic version of him. And so where my art is in this show gets complicated. It got complicated even working with the museum when the first draft of the invitation, actually it's the invitation that went out, for better or worse, said that it was a show of James Lee Byers' work curated by Matt Morris. Couldn't be taxonomically further from my desires. But I think even that showed the maybe some of the thresholds of recognizing where my hand is and where I'm diverging from, as I was gesturing to with Willem de Rooij, a sense of responsibility that a curator might have, or the ethics of an art historian to have a sort of due diligence of how you build an argument to create sort of canonical history. That if I instead prefer gossip and innuendo and association and imagination and maybe most of all fantasy, then we're in I think we're in a sort of blatantly different discipline. So this is one tableau from that exhibition. On the right is a pink silk tail that Byers made for a performance in 1970 that got displayed here and then used in another way that I'll get to. And then on the left is a bit of Balenciaga couture from the period. Byers in these performances in the 60s and 70s tended to costume in one of two different ways. Either he made eccentric but cheaply produced costuming with a couple of collaborators, or he went straight to the high end and bought Balenciaga or Pierre Cardin, just like the couturiers and fashion designers of the era. I was attracted to the shared color, and a color that really became part of the narrative of the overall exhibition. But this plinth ends up being my gestures and the arrangement, right? Like, that might be the important thing to say there. This is an image of Byers that's in the Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive, and when I came across it, I think it represents exactly who I'm looking for, who I'm fantasizing about, and who I'm sort of coaxing out from between the primary text of art history as he's remembered. There's showmanship, there's a top hat, it's flamboyant and blousy, but also his face is hidden, and he's shrouded in this delicate pale pink. That's both his costuming and also this expanse of material that extends alongside his body. This is the way that photograph got shown in the exhibition. It's one of the weirder points for me in the overall project. The photograph got printed on the paper that was ultimately used for the exhibition catalog, and it was hung with this patterned tape that has little kiss imprints on it. On this, I'm not sure what to call it, this wing that the exhibition crew made for me. And so it's a place too where like my gesture is somewhere between the moves, not making the apparatus off of the wall, not printing the image, but just sort of bringing these parts together. And this is a moment that I usually spend a bit more time with to critique my own decision-making here, that I'll try to do sort of quickly, that this is a model that we're seeing happen in art institutions where young emerging artists get paired with modern masters as a way to extend the cultural cred of both sides, to re-excite the relevance of sort of peripheral figures within modernism and emerging postmodernism, and also to give me cultural capital and leverage as I'm going into the next stage of my career. And it's not happening only in museums. We see this in commercial galleries. I'm thinking of like the Andrea Rosen exhibition of Sterling Ruby and Lucia Fontana, where Sterling selected works of Fontana's to arrange within an exhibition of his work. And actually, while we were working on this show, a gallery in Paris mounted an exhibition of Byers and Anish Kapoor, who has obviously considerably more cultural leverage within our field than I do. But I want to acknowledge that there's a kind of dirtiness to this enterprise of carrying my own history with me, being instructive in where I want to be positioned within historical lineages and legacies. And while doing that, I also want to add another memory to the braid that I'm exploring as I'm talking to you, that something that became important while I was in graduate school was seeing that my stakes in how we remember art history aren't primarily academic or scholarly. While that's a concern, there's a rooting deeper in really personal, tenderly attached relationships to art. So I will offer one example that I have this memory, maybe fourth, maybe fifth grade, of sitting on a playground at recess and holding a book that had images of work by Felix Gonzalez Torres and Ross Bleckner and Ronnie Horn in it. And I didn't understand any of that work at the time, but I was looking at it and kind of imagining what world that occupied, and then looked up and looked at my recurrent bullies coming toward me, already saying faggot and saying we're going to beat the shit out of you. And holding the book and hearing their taunts and looking down at the image and saying, I'm just going to hold this in my mind. I'm going to be able to go there. I can be there one day. And I guess I want to sort of risk going to this emotional place to be able to change the tone of what these questions might be that I'm enacting within institutional space, because there are also ways that I can acknowledge that I was already deeply attached to what the promise might be within those histories before I got here. This is a project by Sterile. I think it's kind of like if you pressed me and said, what's your favorite artwork? I think this is kind of currently my favorite artwork. It's unfair to show it to you in slide form. It's both a video piece and also an installation. But it gets at something that I think plays out in my own work at different points over the past few years. It's predicated on the legend that in Theodore Adorno's lecture hall, he asked to have the walls painted a specific shade of gray. I don't know if this is a specific shade of gray, but it's kind of gray. And he said supposedly that that gray was the only color that was conducive to thinking. And so Sterile goes to this lecture hall and, working with the two conservators you see in the image, digs out a section of the wall to look for the gray and to excavate it. And actually, fairly quickly in the video work, they go all the way back down to the mortar, and there's no gray. This is an invented story. And the video does a few other things that I'm also very invested in, that attempts to weave populist-oriented philosophy in the 20th century into the growth of formalist painting aesthetics, especially the monochrome, and show that these are parallel and sort of related histories. And that's been very rewarding for me. But one of the tasks that Sterile gives her conservators here is that since there's no gray, they will need to manufacture a gray. So using the scalpels that they have, they start making hatch marks into the plaster to create an uneven texture that, standing at any distance, creates a sort of silvery gray. And this is a move, again, kind of looking at where my stakes are, what my responsibilities are to thinking about creating alternatives to history that actually function as fantasies or wish fulfillment or a way to manifest desire materially, creating this gray wall that was supposed to be there because everyone said it was always there and it wasn't there, so they made it themselves. Here's another view. This is a shot of the lecture hall that's right across the back. This is a project from 2014 at a gallery in Philadelphia called Fjord. I was invited to be in a show of figure paintings. You might have noticed by now that I don't make figure paintings. And so it really started with a question back to the curator of, why do you want me here? And what am I supposed to do here? And so I did what I know to do at this point. I started researching the institution, finding out who started it and who pays for it and how long it's been there and what its mission had been. And I came across fairly quickly that on Facebook posts and things, they had recently said goodbye to one of their collective members who had moved away to grad school, and his name is Sean Robert Fitzgerald. And I still haven't actually met Sean, although we stay in touch by email. And I think I started to kind of fantasize the possibility that the space missed him, that he left the space and the space felt, the gallery felt abandoned by him, that it missed him. So we see this, the title of this work is Miss Sean, and it's got sort of multiple layered meanings of both longing and gender. And so there are a few different entry points of how, like different little objects that came together to comprise this work. One was gay cruising apps like Scruff and Grindr that we see up here. So these are apps on your phone, if you're not familiar, that spatialize other users who are online at the same time as you, and you can see who's closest to you and then communicate on whether or not you want to meet up and have sex sooner or later. And so on the left, I intervened on Sean's profiles on these applications in a few ways, some text interventions, but mostly the image. We were having discussions about his time living in Philadelphia, and I had been asking him questions about artworks that he had particularly emotional experiences with, and this Staircase group by Charles Wilson Peele that's in the PMA's collection is one that he wrote some beautiful letters to me about the experiences he had. And as I want to do, I became curious on how this shot of two young men ascending a staircase and one kind of leaning around the doorway with maybe in this context more of a come hither sort of physical posture than it might be seen just in the museum becomes the frontispiece for Sean's presence on these applications during the run of the exhibition. Meanwhile, the gallery graciously agreed to set up profiles for the gallery itself on these apps. And so this is what people would see, this image of the empty gallery with the information about the space. And we agreed on something like, not a script, but sort of loose prompts, that if someone texted them and said, "How big is it?" they would give the dimensions of the gallery. Or if someone said, "What are you into?" they would say, "Contemporary art." Specifically a show about figure painting right now. And it was playful and exploratory to see what happens if I use a set of tools that exist in one part of my life that have a sort of a priori assumption of eroticism and use it as a means of locating and situating and articulating qualities about the exhibition space. But maybe the thing I want to say most of all about these two images next to each other is that if Sean and Fjord were both signed into these, there's a sort of impossible possibility that that they could see each other, that they could find each other, that if my fantasy that the space misses him, these apps could be a way that they could reach across space from Pennsylvania to Connecticut and actually find each other, that somewhere, if you could go scroll down far enough, they'd eventually find each other and then could be reunited. I don't know how much that's coming across. Ooh, these don't look right color-wise, so I'm just gonna apologize. Monochromes don't really work in slide lectures because you don't have any context for color. I don't know how much it's coming out in what I'm saying so far, but I would say that there's a bit of sadism in my work. There's a bit of like a demand that someone else do something that I've asked them to do or to submit to my desires. And in the process of working on this with Sean, he had a desire that emerged. And so alongside working on the apps and so on, he said, "Well, you've been making monochrome paintings in your studio, and I've been making monochrome paintings. What if we made a painting for each other?" And so I made this painting on the left called Mr. Green that was on display during the exhibition in the gallery. But also on the exhibition's artwork lists in the gallery, this other piece was mentioned, and it had this caption that this painting called Peel Painting was made by Sean for me, and that it was on view in my studio in Chicago as a component of this exhibition. So I can't go into this in full force, but those of you who were at the dinner last night, I talked a bit about strategies of dispersal, strategies that actually don't allow the viewer to ever apprehend the artwork fully in one spot, that fragments are dispersed across space or across different contexts, and that there's something kind of ontological about not actually giving in to the assumption that I could make something whole, and this sort of distribution or dispersal is a move that happens in museums, like the example of putting the curtains in the members' lounge. So within one space, something might call across the space and be removed from your immediate access, or things could be in different cities across the country as a project. And then this is the last part of that fjord piece, was the museum postcard of that artwork. The museum had actually stopped making the postcards, so this is maybe the first time I got really close to Sherry Levine, but not the last in my work, that we just made forgeries of the postcard. And so I have like 500 of them if you ever want any. We just needed the one, but that was like the lowest order. And it hung on the wall as you see it on the left, just the image. So the audience didn't have access to this on the back, and I'm interested in how that lives mostly in lectures here. It was just luck or sort of fortune that at the time of the exhibition, the U.S. Postal Service had started making these Marston Hartley stamps that, for those of you who are familiar with his history, these are abstract paintings that are meant to be love letters to his gay lover who is in the German military at the time. So that was just lucky. And I'm going to read the text and try not to blush. The boys in the painting haven't washed their clothes, and they want you to follow them upstairs. There is singing and grunting coming from the room that used to be your studio. The steps remember your eager ascents. The floor remembers your bare skin. The boys, smeared with paint, hastily undressing, want you down on your knees, licking up stray hairs from between the floorboards. With your face pressed into musky grime, boys pile up behind you in a chorus, the room, the gallery, the Peel painting, and I profess I miss Sean. And that was mailed to him afterwards. So it's not the last time that I've sort of created temporary intimacies with gallery staff or museum staff, and this is a project that we might recall the pink tail from earlier that's displayed next to the Balenciaga in the Perfect Kiss exhibition. This is a photograph that you come across further down the space called I'll Be Wearing Ribbons Down My Back This Summer. For the photograph, the collector who owns this buyer's work agreed to let us use it in a performed sort of moment that got photographed, and that was also a moment of sort of graceful adventuresomeness from him, that he permitted this piece that was made to be performed briefly. And then it's worn by one of the museum preparators that was installing the show. So it's not uncommon for me to ask someone who works at a gallery or museum to be naked for a photograph that will hang in the place that they work for the exhibition run. And that, that puts pressures and says something about my desires and theirs to be willing to be seen in this way by their coworkers. And but it's mostly, I think, for me, I mean, the sort of sexual fantasy of it for me is what happens between the shows. Several of the studio visits I've had, we've talked about like the invisible labor of exhibition spaces and the people who come in between shows to make the space ready for you. And I'm excited by, in several ways, the what could happen between shows. And this sort of delicate romantic shot of this figure slipping between the architecture wearing a pink devil's tail, I think kind of starts to get at that fantasy that we get the tool cart with the level and the drill and the boxes that the artwork came out of. And those are all just like as we found them, and then kind of interjecting this figure sort of, I feel really self-conscious saying the word weaving here because of the fiber program. I keep noticing I'm jumping around it every time I nearly say it. So the figure's not weaving, what's he doing? He's tiptoeing. So I said earlier that for the most part, I resisted the sort of canonical, heroic, monolithic works of Byers, with one notable exception. And this one was a hard piece for me to figure out how to make fit in the show. I can say frankly that the press department had emailed me early on and said, could you write your press release because we don't know how to make the show sound good. Um, and and then several weeks later, they were like, you know what would really help is if you showed that giant piece made out of all the roses. I feel like, and they did. They had like date night themed events and like there was brunches that had rosewater French toast. Like there were lots of tie-ins because of this work, and I was having a really hard time knowing how to put something with this much presence alongside an exhibition that had so much delicacy and was all mostly white and pale pink and gray and silver. It helped that in researching the work, it is a sphere that is covered in 3,333 red roses. And unlike the Willem de Roy flower arrangements that I showed earlier, which do get refreshed, and so they are a huge financial commitment when they're on view in a gallery, these are meant to die. So it was a feasible component of the exhibition because we could just do it once and then it could wilt. And one of the things that meant, apart from just the finance, the budget of the exhibition, is that red was going to go away pretty fast. So we see it here in full bloom, but in a matter of days, it crumbles into a sort of Merlot brown that actually made more sense to the palette of the show. It's also positioned in a place in the exhibition that it's mostly behind you. You see it and then turn and go into the space. So this is just beyond the curtains, but before you enter and go through most of the rest of the exhibition. So also that I could place it so that it would mostly be in your memory or at least behind you was helpful. Another reason that I felt that this piece, I was able to make sense of what it could do here in the show was that with especially major works in artist careers, the provenance matters quite a bit. And this is something that happens for all works, but we rarely talk about, except art historians. That the provenance is the list of everyone who's owned the work and everywhere it's ever been shown. And I was similar to that moment with the Man Ray photograph of having it listed as the materials of another artist's work. I was intrigued by what happens that now the word queer is in the permanent record of this object, that the provenance of James Lee Byers' The Rose Table of Perfect lists questioning queer among the official text that accompanies this work. So every time it gets reshown and another institution shows its provenance or has it available, and the permanent archive within the museum that owns it in Spain, it has language in it that was not there before. And that sort of shift of language and material should at this point in the talk make sense for why I would be so attracted to it. And so that provenance got listed on the wall, sort of just beyond this shot, that we have the sculpture, but also the provenance is one of the works in the exhibition. And it took a while to know how to balance that. And so I wanted to make a work called Archive for this exhibition, and I made a lot of bad ones, I will be frank, just ugly digital prints and things that were trying really hard. And one day I was cooking dinner after teaching and before my partner got home and looked over at our refrigerator and saw all of the vases that have become part of my life over years. And so I decided to show all of the vases at the far end of the exhibition space. So at one end we've got thousands of roses, and at the other we have empty vases. And both had something like their provenances listed. That next to the vases was a sort of object index that listed when the vases came into my life and who gave them to me. And in the best of cases, I could remember what the flower arrangements were that were in them. And so it gets, and it's very disclosing. Two of them came from the reception that accompanied my BFA thesis show. And one was a housewarming gift that my parents had delivered when I first moved to Chicago. And the bit of pink on the one pink face belonged to my grandmother, who's passed away. And the one in the center, the little white cylinder, was a gift from Heidi, who's my sort of on-again, off-again florist collaborator. And so a lot about my life is known just by sharing these in the space and putting this history in the same font and in the same placement as the official art historical history, the provenance of the rose table. Okay, there are a few more projects still. So this is a piece of Byers called This that was going to be part of the exhibition. And then maybe 3 months before we started install, Jane Corman of Mr. and Mrs. Leonard Corman, who's super sweet, a real lovely lady, and I'm really happy to have gotten to work with her to the extent that I did, emailed me and said, well, you know that sculpture you're going to borrow, it's been in the backyard for 15 years. I don't know if it can be moved. So we had a conservator go and do a condition report on them, and they're basalt stone, and really they're basically just rubble now. And so they're this giant stone artwork that was going to be a sort of key part of the show, and it evaporated from the checklist. The label here is incorrect. It should be 1985. I attached to this work in a really personal way that I was a conjoined twin, and I was born in 1985, and there are these two spheres, and it's me and my twin. And so I really needed it to be in the show, and I got histrionic when it fell through. But it ended up being a moment of an opportunity for me to notice something about my own work, that when maybe absence or rejection, or when the door shuts from too many questions, what have you, two strategies that I employ is to fantasize about what might have been and to annotate or mark out the absence, to call attention to what's missing. These are two things that happen again and again and again in my work. So as I had been preparing for the show for a couple of years, my twin, Michael, had given me these two small, like this big rose quartz spheres that were meant to be a sort of talisman for this show. Michael's a bit witchy, and I mean, I am too. It's not like they got all the witchiness. And so I was trying to figure out maybe a substitution for that missing Byers sculpture. And so I worked with a couple of photographers who knew more about this than I did. And we shot photographs of the small spheres, and at a high enough resolution that they could be printed at the exact dimensions of the Byers sculpture. So this photograph was presented laying flat on the floor, on a low plinth, and was this sort of footprint or shadow or echo or memory of this Byers sculpture that had been sort of digested or processed through personal gifts between family members, and had been sort of presented as this photo memory in lieu of the sculpture. So one of the only other artists that I'll bring up, I think this is the last other artist that I'll bring up before we wrap up with my most recent projects, is this project by Dana DiGiulio that was at the Suburban in Oak Park, just outside of Chicago, at the end of 2013. It's a project that I bring in because I think it does all of the things I've been talking about, of revealing the different ways that our relationships get kind of piled on one another in the art world, and it's a gesture that seems to kind of cut across that sort of conglomerate. So Dana DiGiulio lives in New York now, but at the time, painter based in Chicago, and one of Michelle Grabner's former students and then colleagues. And Michelle, as I'm sure many of you know, was curating the Whitney Biennial at the time, and the list had just been released of who was involved, who was going to be part of the floor that she had curated. Dana was not one of those artists. I feel like that's important contextual information. So what Dana did, she wasn't offered a spot in the Whitney Biennial, but she was offered a show in a little cinder blocks building in the backyard of Michelle Grabner. So she, years earlier, Michelle had given her this silver point painting that we see on the left, the Tondo, the circular painting. Dana sold the painting on the secondary market, took the gift and sold it through James Cohen Gallery, which had recently picked up Michelle as an artist to represent after she had been publicly named as one of the curators of the biennial. And Dana made several $1,000s off of the sale of the painting, with which she bought this Le Sabre four-door sedan that on the morning of the opening of the exhibition, she crashed into the side of the building and wrecked the foundation and broke all of the windows in the gallery structure, and that's really full, right? That's a lot, and I think years later I'm continuing to sort of process that choice that seems so violent and so petulant, but also risks being very revealing about the ways that someone can be your mentor and then your colleague and then also your friend and then also a sort of symbolic mother and then your gallerist but not your Whitney curator, and pile that all into the car and ram it into the side of the gallery and walk away. At the far end of the perfect kiss, at the end of the exhibition, are these two sister pieces called Cerebra Lucinda and Cerebra Yvonne. They are also ruched, similar to the curtains, a ruched satin casing that draws out this X in the space. And as the shadows, I think, can help illuminate in documentation form, optically, perceptually, this reads as an X, as a single sort of graphic character, until you get closer, and then they're actually at some distance from one another, cutting across the space in two different trajectories. And I would say that there's still a lot about this gesture that's mysterious to me, if I'm honest. But one of the things that I think I've come to see for myself is that I think it marks out trajectories of personal and art histories that intersect, but also diverge from one another. Things that had come up again and again in this exhibition ends off with this X of two lines sort of involved in a dance that seem to be connected but are also not connected. And so then gestalt and fantasy and filling in what you want to have happened, how you might think or want these things to have intersected, ends up being kind of the end point. That I felt some pressure that the title of the exhibition, The Perfect Kiss, had come from a buyer's piece, a performance that was included in the show. And I felt that I needed to at least gesture towards a response, respond to that as the sort of title and premise of what maybe idealized connection and attachment could mean for me. And I think it has respectful distance and difference, acknowledged difference within the form. So I'm going to skate through this last part because this is the new part, and I'm a little over. So these are the works that I've been making since last fall up to the present. And several, I had a lot of exhibitions at the same time in the fall, and so the next few projects were all up at the same time in different cities. And so this was a work that was shown in Cleveland, and it's called The Sorceress, and I will actually just read the text here. A red dress sewn by the artist's twin, Michael J. Morris, as costuming for a dance entitled Shades of the Edged Existence, which Michael choreographed and presented in 2007. So I think I was still trying to process that big bad ball of roses. Just really, that was a lot of red. I was really overstimulated in a sort of formalist way, but it was also jogging a memory. And my mother's mother had been passed away for nearly 10 years, but my parents and aunt had really delayed in cleaning out the house. And I had this memory of this red dress that my sibling and I would dress up in when we were children, that my grandmother had made for my mom when she was a teenager. And so I called my father because I said, I'm thinking about this red dress and I would like the red dress, but I don't want anyone to feel bad if they've already thrown it away, because loss is hell and sometimes you have to purge to go through it. So is there a way we can gingerly ask my mother and my aunt if there's a red dress still around? And actually, they were totally fine. They were just like, oh, I don't think that's a real thing. That never existed. I have no memory of a red dress. And so I asked Michael, my twin, and they also said that they had no memory of this red dress. And so I was like, well, that's curious, and texted and said, you should be getting a picture about now of you about 7 years old wearing the red dress. So do you remember now? And then they said that they sort of did, but similar to things that I've talked about across this talk, the object that I wanted is missing. Michael doesn't remember the red dress, and yet for their BFA thesis work, curated or choreographed a performance that costumed everyone in red dresses. So I trust that it's somewhere back there. And then that became a really appropriate substitute in the absence of the red dress my grandmother made for my mother that ultimately lent itself to our earliest gender experimentations. I was able to use my twins' red dress as this floor sculpture. At the same time, in another gallery, I made these curtains called Hysteria. They're the last curtains I've made. I don't have a need to make more of them right now. I'll let them breathe for a little bit. These were really difficult for me, and I'm not sure I entirely know why yet, but I titled it Hysteria long before it was crafted, and I had been reading Catherine Clément and Hélène Cixous's The Newly Born Woman, in which they characterized the hysteric as a kind of feminist forerunner, basically that she had been so repressed by patriarchy for so long that she had to find other ways to survive, and so she's actually a useful roadmap for us to figure out alternatives for survival within patriarchal capitalism. And that hysteria, according to Clément and Cixous, is jouissance repressed. So jouissance, this non-translated word in English of a sort of excess of ecstasy or joy or orgasm or a sort of too much of feeling lived out within patriarchy becomes hysteria. And so that ended up being the point of departure for this work. And maybe the thing, we were talking last night at the dinner, people said that they would like to not have to go to their own art openings. And I do go to my own art openings, but at this one I left. I got there and I started to cry and I told the curator I had to leave. And so the way these ruched curtains get constructed is that there are these tapes that have drawstrings inside of them. And those would ordinarily be, if we think of decor, those would be facing outward because the curtain, this kind of decorative curtain, is really meant to be a component of the interior space. And there was something that I never even questioned it until I was at the opening, that the tapes were on the inside, which seemed to suggest that my position was outside. And so I think this story that I've brought up a couple of times became very real, that this giant pink thing seemed to anticipate my being cast out of the gallery and being outside on the street, and that my audience or my community wasn't in this place, it was somewhere else, and I felt the need to leave. At the same time, there's another exhibition and I called this project Jouissance for the reasons that I just mentioned. I am gonna read this part, I think. So this was I was thinking about a text that Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick wrote as she was dying of breast cancer, where she had 3 or 4 research projects that I think she feared she wasn't gonna actually get to. So she sort of wrote an essay about how she might write those other things. And I find that there are sort of strategic, good, productive moments for me to sometimes look across the different media and the different projects I'm working on. And jouissance, if we think about this as a space of being too much and having a little too much feeling, it seemed like a nice place to gather some things. So on the table is a chiffon dressing coat designed and made by Vincent Tiley and Jeffrey Hart, duplicating a costume they made for a drag queen named Pearl, who wore it on RuPaul's Drag Race Season 7, Episode 14, which aired on June 1st, 2015. In the back right corner is a 2-scale inkjet print of Jean-Antoine Watteau's Pastoral Gathering that's part of the collection of the Art Institute of Chicago. Back left corner is an oil painting of mine on linen on panel that's 12 inches by 16 inches. And the front corner is a marbled watercolor sheet. And beside it is lists composed in ink on tracing paper. And then the plinth itself, this table was made out of the same materials and scale to coordinate with the strange structure of Gallery 400's flooring at the University of Illinois at Chicago. So the coat here is made from the same pink chiffon that the first one was, that Jeffrey and Vincent made, and dictated the material of this curtain as well. So I don't think I would ever choose to live with this much pink around me. Little doses, not big ones. And it was indeed too much. And then at the same time, so we have, hopefully we're kind of building a color story here, that there was a dark red dress and then a pink curtain and a pink dressing gown, and now we're in white, and this is all happening across several states in multiple exhibitions. So this is a work called The White Queen. I go into some detail about this in the readings that Dane distributed that we discussed last night, so if people want a much more in-depth account, it's available. But I will say here that I worked with a fashion designer named Randall Hill to design a custom harness and collar for one of the directors of the gallery called the Franklin, Dan Sullivan. And Dan had designed the sort of exterior facade of the gallery that you see behind him, these white diagonal lattices, and that was the departure point for Randall's design. Dan wore the harness for this photograph and then during the opening, and then it hung in the space on display for the exhibition, and then afterwards he received it as a gift, and it's very, very possible that he never wanted a white BDSM harness that was made custom for him. This is a project that's up right now, and so this will be where I wrap up a little, this and a couple of paintings that I'm working on. I was asked to be in a show at the Elmhurst Art Museum called Chicago Statements, and this is the first time I'm talking about it in public, so we'll see how it goes. I was asked to be the queer and trans voice of the exhibition, and I said that I was only one of those things, and that my experience is that my friends whose that identity is not mine would probably not appreciate me speaking on their behalf. And I needed to figure out how to be involved, given this as an expectation. And so what I ended up asking them to do, because as we've been talking about for days, as I've been here, I'm troubled by how queer maybe gets used and the assumptions that it get kind of attached to it. And so asking myself what that gesture would mean in this exhibition, I asked the museum to allow me to annotate the artwork labels of all the other artists in the show. And so what I did, that this label is at the end of the exhibition, and like clues you into what you've been seeing, is that throughout the exhibition are these labels that beneath the artwork details are these passages of text. The texts are collages from the authors listed here. They are not attributed in any place. We have this list of authors, but who wrote what is not clarified. All the text is in this dark violet ink. So the top half of the labels were in black ink, as is the convention within the museum, and then below it are these dark violet passages that, as we've heard back from visitors, they seem to be doing what they need to do, that it is not clear if this is an artist statement that the artists whose works are represented on the label are describing, or if this is a museum didactic written by the curator, or who's speaking. And that sort of doubt, that disorientation, the fragmentation and collaging of perspectives and voices within a space that we're used to clear didactics, I think is the work that I'm interested in this work, in this piece. It's called The Revolt of the Violet, which is taken from the title of a poem by Florian Stettheimer, a painter that is involved in a lot of my current projects. And this is the newest work. It's the last things we'll show, this and one other slide. So I think this came from some of that thing that happened with this sculpture of Byers that was made the year I was born, that I think I started. I've been doing some research in a couple of museums and searching based on dates and looking at what was made the year I was born, and what happens if, this is happening within an artist's practice, and arbitrarily I was born at the same time. But can I cut across those histories, mine and the artists and their oeuvre, and bridge connections? So Sherry Levine, who's known mostly for her photographs of other artists' photographs, in 1985 started making these abstract paintings that are stripes or checker patterns, and they're in cassine on mahogany, and cassine is a paint made out of milk that she was interested in for its uses in common use among American illustrators and designers in the mid-20th century. And I am probably interested more because of the ways it can symbolize in relationship to birth and nurturing. So I have started making her paintings, working with a woodworker to make mahogany panels, and I've been reenacting the paintings as they were made, with the one shift that they are, when they were shown by Sherry in the 80s, they were shown as vertical paintings, and I have laid them on their sides and called them Sleeping Sherrys, which might be a little corny, but I'm into it. So these are two of the current paintings that maybe involve me and my questions in art history and archives in another way, where I'm starting to reenact artworks that have come before me. And that is all I've got. I would, of course, be thrilled